So today I wanted to talk about the books that I read in September / also August, because I didn't do an August wrap up, and I have some thoughts on all the books that I read in the last couple of months. So this is my August / September reading wrap up. So I'll start with what I read while I was on holiday in August, because those were the books that I read first, and I'm actually going to start with a series that I completed in August, and that is the Raven Cycle series by Maggie Stiefvater. I had read book 1 and 2 quite a few years ago now. I want to say 2-3 years ago I read The Raven Boys and Dream Thieves. I enjoyed The Raven Boys. I thought it was a good setup and premise, but felt very confused and lost during The Dream Thieves and really wasn't into it. It felt I had no idea what was going on the entire time, I'll be honest. So I think that's sort of why it took me a while to get around to the third one, which is Blue Lily, Lily Blue, and I really enjoyed it. It felt like a return to form as it was. I can't really go into like the specifics of the third book because that obviously gives away the first two. But The Raven Cycle as a series is about this group of friends in, I want to say Virginia, but just generally somewhere in the US of A, and they are searching for a dead Welsh king. I don't really have much to say on the third one, aside from like I really enjoyed it. I felt really engrossed. I did feel quite lost because it had been a long time since I read The Dream Thieves, so I wasn't entirely sure what was going on in parts, and I had forgotten multiple things. But on the whole, I really enjoyed it. I read it very quickly. I think I read it in about a day. It definitely did a lot for me. And so then as soon as I got back from holiday, I decided instead of waiting for like another 2 years to actually finish the series, that I would just get through the fourth one as soon as I could whilst it was all fresh in my mind, because I knew I probably would feel very lost again if I left it too long between reading the two. But I felt really disappointed with the fourth one. It was just very anticlimactic. Like, a lot of the elements that had been put into the story in the first 3 books just didn't seem to really deliver in the final one. Like, even kind of like the big thing that we'd been working towards the whole time didn't really have much of an impact. It just felt really flat at the end for me. I don't feel like it kind of really focused on all of the characters as well as it could. There were a lot of revelations that kind of felt like they came a little bit too late in the game. Instead of just focusing on what should have been the bare bones of the plot that we've been working on this whole time, there were so many other like subplots that were new additions to the fourth book, which just kind of like muddied the waters a bit. So I'm not entirely sure I would recommend the series as a whole, because I found the fourth book really disappointing, which is a shame because I did have a lot of fun reading the first and the third book. I also finally read Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, which I've been threatening to read since like June. Well, technically I've had it on my shelves for years, but I finally got around to reading it, which is a much stranger novel than I was expecting, and I really enjoyed it, but I think I need to reread it because I started it on the plane on the way to Spain, and it was a mistake to do that because it's a book that requires a certain level of concentration, and you can't really do that when there's like screaming children around you. So the premise of the book is it's about an American called Billy Pilgrim who kind of time travels. We'll get to that bit. He fought in the Second World War, and he was present in Dresden when the Allies bombed it, and it very much shaped his life experiences as something as traumatic as that would. So it's very non-linear in its storytelling. So it's not like he's born, then he goes to school, then he's in the war, and then he becomes a dentist, and then he marries, and then he dies. It's all of those things happening kind of at once, which is why you kind of need a certain level of concentration. He also gets abducted by aliens though, which is where it kind of takes it out of the realm of realism and into just like straight bizarre. I very much viewed it as a commentary on PTSD and what it's like to live with post-traumatic stress disorder. It was a very short novel and it was very impactful for its length, I think, though it goes. And then I read Our Endless Numbered Days by Claire Fuller, which again is a book that I'd had on my shelves for a really long time. It's a novel about a young girl whose father takes her to live in a cabin in a woods and who tells her that the world has ended and they are the only two survivors. It's a very dark novel and it's very realistic, which sounds really weird considering how I've just described it, but it is all told in the past, so you're hearing her thoughts as a grown-up when she has re-entered society and she's realised that the world hasn't ended. And based on that, I'm quite surprised that a lot of people were surprised by the ending. I thought it was quite clear quite early on what was happening, what was going on. But I will say it did kind of drag. It felt like a novella which had been stretched as much as it could. Really not a lot happens in this novel. There's just a lot of long descriptions of nature and what it's like living in a rundown cabin with your mad dad. So I think I would have really liked this if it had been like 120 pages or something. I think it would have been much more impactful if it was that length. As it was, it just felt a little bit too long and drawn out. It was okay, but not a new favourite at all. I think I rated it 3 stars. So it was alright, but I would never bother revisiting it. And then the final book that I read on my holiday, so we're still in August, was a Kim Jong-il production by Paul Fisher, which is about the abduction of 2 South Korean filmmakers to North Korea in order for them to create the best cinema they possibly could for North Korea. So obviously going into this book, I expected it to be somewhat about North Korea. What I didn't expect, and what I was quite a pleasant surprise, was all of the other elements that kind of went into the book. Like, it was a really good comprehensive history of North Korea. Kim Jong-il, I learned so much about Kim Jong-il. Like, I didn't realise he was such a huge movie buff. That kind of blew my mind. So it's a really interesting look at the country. If you've never read anything or watched anything about North Korea before and you are interested in its history, I think this book is really concise. But what I really wasn't expecting, and what was a really pleasant surprise, was that it is also pretty comprehensive in terms of film. It goes into quite a bit of detail about the films that the couple made before being abducted to North Korea, as well as obviously what happened after they had been abducted, as well as like a bit of a history of North Korean cinema. At the end, it had a little brief summary of Paul Fisher, the author, and I'm fairly certain I'm right in saying that he went to film school, and you can completely tell. Like, it's really clear that he is also a film buff. So he's a film buff writing about film buffs. One of them happens to be Kim Jong-il. Very strange situation. But the love of film and how magical cinema can be was really well conveyed. So it had a lot of different elements going on, and I think they all worked really well. I would really recommend this book. I would recommend it to anybody who's like me, interested in communist states. Weird interest to have, I know. Anybody who has any passing interest in North Korea, wants to learn more about it. And anybody who is a film buff. Like, honestly, I think you would really enjoy this if you like cinema in any capacity. Okay, so moving on to September now. I read 2 books in September, the first of which was Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. So Kindred is about a black woman in the 1970s, I believe it was written in the 1970s, who ends up travelling back in time to the 1800s, to the antebellum South, and has to continuously save this white boy who turns out to be one of her ancestors. I think it's fair to say that that in and of itself is an incredible premise. The problem that I had with it at the start of the book was that the characters seemed to have very little emotion. More, it was that how everybody reacted to the fact that she time travelled, because she told quite a lot of people and everybody was kind of like, okay, cool. Like, there was just no real emotional response to what was happening. I don't really care how it was happening or why. Like, I'm not fussed that it never went into how she managed to time travel or why specifically her out of everybody in her family line had to go back and save this boy. But the fact that nobody was interested in exploring it, like, within the universe, kind of bothered me. So it took me quite a while to get into it, and to be honest, I almost stopped reading because I really wasn't feeling it. But by about page 120, something happened that suddenly kind of like upped the stakes a little bit, and from then on it kind of became a lot more plot heavy than it previously had been, and that made it more interesting. The characters, I would say, on the whole, were still underdeveloped, but there was more of a build-up of quite a unique and interesting and complex relationship between the protagonist Dana and the man that she has to keep on saving, Rufus. I think this book would work really well as a film or as a TV series of some sort. Like, I can imagine actors really adding that emotional depth that I felt was missing. And then the final book that I read in September was American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. Now, I did actually watch the film first. I watched it towards the beginning of the month and I really enjoyed the film. I thought it was very darkly funny and also terrifying and very thought-provoking. So I already had the book on my shelves and I thought it was time that I read it. Now, I had heard a lot of warnings about the book before picking it up, that it was extremely violent, but from seeing the film I thought, I think I can handle this level of violence. Like, if it goes into a little bit more detail about what I've seen on the screen, I'm fairly certain I can cope with that. I don't think it will be anything that different from what I have maybe read before, so I think I'll be fine with it. I wasn't. If anybody's been living under a rock, American Psycho is about Patrick Bateman, who is somebody who works on Wall Street. I'm not entirely sure what he does, but I don't think he really does anything, so it doesn't really matter. And he is the typical 80s yuppie, and he also may or may not be a horrific serial killer. I actually couldn't finish reading this book. I had to stop reading this. I think I only had like 50 pages to go, but it was too much for me to take in. This was so visceral and so descriptive. It's not just that he's saying that he kills somebody, it is him going into great detail about how he tortures predominantly women. He does kill men as well, but none of them seem to be tortured in the same way that women are, and it is deeply uncomfortable to read, and that is the point. I get that that's the point, but there's also nothing in me that wants to read the sort of violence that was described in this novel. Like, it genuinely made me feel nauseous. Aside from the violence, the rest of the book is incredibly dull. It is essentially just listicles. It's just Patrick Bateman listing every single designer piece of clothing that his friends are wearing, every single food order that they make. It's mind-numbingly dull. And again, that's the point. I believe that is the point. I get what Bret Easton Ellis was trying to do, because he has created this narrative that is so mind-numbingly dull that you do, at the beginning, when there's not really any violence or when the violence is very minimal, you do sort of think like, okay, come on Patrick, kill somebody, like, change this up. I need to get out of this rigmarole now. It is so dull. And that's the point. It's trying to put you in the position that Patrick's in, where he's just having these constantly shallow, meaningless conversations all the time. However, you do then get to the violence, and it does get very violent. The beginning of the book, it genuinely doesn't seem too bad. It's towards the end, it genuinely gets horrific. And then suddenly it's like, well, no, take me back to the listicles. But then you're back at the listicles and it's not enjoyable. There's no part of this book that was enjoyable for me. I don't think it's supposed to be enjoyable. In all fairness, I don't think people are supposed to enjoy it. I think if you do enjoy it, that's maybe a worry. And that's the point of that book. It was written to be mind-numbingly dull and then horrifically, viscerally violent, to make you think. But the film did that for me without being that dull and without being that violent. So I don't think it needed to go as hard. Like, it didn't need to lean in as hard on those ideas as it did. So that's it. That's my reading wrapped up. That was an attempt to close a book, but apparently a very big book. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully I'll see you very soon. Bye!